Well, folks, I'd like to welcome everyone to an impromptu Zoom meeting from Harry Fuller. Um, Harry,
Second.
oops, Harry will be, I'm going to mute someone who just came in, I hope. See? There we go. Harry will be leading our field trip in the Ashland, Oregon area in search of the great gray owl. He's been studying great gray owls for some time and is really an expert on them, especially in his area, and seems to know where they are nesting, breeding, and having young, which is really exciting. The great gray owl is not easy to find in California. There's a few spots in the slopes of the Sierras where there are great gray owls. The most, I think, common one is in the vicinity of Yosemite. But we're really looking forward to Harry's talk. The only announcement I have is that there are quite a number of Earth Day activities coming up, and we hope you'll check out our website and participate in some of them. The first weekend for Earth Day is this coming weekend. So on Saturday the 20th, Napa will be having their Earth Day events, including a Napa Creek cleanup. So we hope you will join Betty Bastida in the Napa Creek cleanup. It begins at 9 on Main Street near Pearl, near Napa Creek right there. We now seem to have most of our participants. I'm still working on muting some folks, but I think we should be good to go, Harry. So without further ado, Harry has been a local Bay Area person for many years and moved up to Ashland, sort of the heartland for great gray owls. So Harry, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Ashland is in Jackson County in Southern Oregon, right on the border. Yet not a single great gray owl has ever been recorded a few miles south in Siskiyou County. None in history. And I talked to a couple of state biologists who live there. They've never even had a rumor of one. There may be as many great gray owls in Jackson County, Oregon, as the entire state of California, where they are endangered. And the reason is, and we'll talk about it more, is that the habitat there is almost perfectly designed to make great gray owls feel at home. I thought this was wonderful. Last year, there was an international nature photography contest run around the globe, and 2 of the pictures, neither one from North America, were of great gray owls. The one on the left is probably a male handing food to a female who's going to carry it to the nest. That's from China. And one on the right is a wintering owl in one of the cities of Finland, perched on what looks like an angel sculpture. So it was the only animal that had 2 winning photos in this large international contest. This is a fascinating story. This is a great gray owl family in northeastern Oregon. A few years ago, I met a biologist who teaches at Eastern Oregon University, which is up in the northeast corner of the state. And he lived on a rural property of dozens of acres, mostly a forest with some meadows. And he knew the great gray owls were around. He'd see them occasionally. But one spring, he was leading his biology class from university out on a field trip to look at wildflowers. And he saw a great horned owl fly by with a great gray owl in its talons. And the great horned owl is probably the worst natural predator on great grays. And he immediately suspected it was the husband of the female who was sitting on a nest of eggs. And sure enough, he went by, and there she was on the eggs. So he knew it wasn't the male, or wasn't the female. And he started live trapping rodents and turning them loose beneath the nest. So he became the foster father. And this is one of the many fantastic pictures he got, because he basically was adopted by the female owl and her youngsters. They got very used to him. They never flew away. They almost ignored him, except the minute he would get there with his cage and open the door, the mom would be right in front of the cage waiting for the rodent to come out. Here she is short tail, probably a mountain vole, feeding it to the babies. And you'll notice the size difference. I'm sure many of you know that owls are not like songbirds. They lay their eggs in a sequence, maybe an egg on Monday, then another one on Thursday, maybe next one on Tuesday, the following week. And that's how they hatch, because the mom starts sitting on the first egg the minute it's laid. She doesn't wait until the nest is full. So they are born in chronological sequence. So there's an older one, there's the next older one, then there's a younger one, and then sometimes they're the youngest, depending on how many there are. But they are always like this, stair-stepped in size. And unlike many species, some of whom I really enjoy, like cranes, they'll lay 2 eggs, they raise 1 baby, and you do not want to know what happens to the loser. This species feeds the youngster first. They have evolved so that when there's food, they raise as many young as they can. And my suspicion is that they evolved in the area where lemmings are quite common. And we know what happens to lemming populations. They explode one year, the next year they collapse. So the great gray owl has developed a survival method of feeding as many young as it possibly can and saving the youngster. They don't feed the big one first. This is a youngster up close, starting to get adult plumage, as you can see, the discs on the face. Here's one taking a bath. In late summer, it gets quite dry in Eastern Oregon, just as it does in much of California. And he would take out containers of water so the youngsters could either play or bathe or have a drink or whatever. And they loved taking a bath. And here he is, turning his head side by side, splashing water all over the place. And there's one in an even deeper container a little bit later in the summer, quite wet, but obviously contented. And there he is, climbing out of the aluminum container with the water in it. And here he is later, cleaning his feathers. They preen their feathers a lot, and they do just what this owl is doing. They start at the base and work their way out on one side to the tip, and then they move their head around and do the other side of the same feather. This is a mom in a nest. That little white fluff ball there on the left is one of the owlets. Whoops, sorry about that. Hit the wrong button there. This is why owls are so good at what they do. Most of you, if you've spent any time at all paying attention to biology, know that our eyes, we have the ability to triangulate with our 2 eyes that don't see the same thing at exactly the same angle. And then the brain puts it together and gives us a 3-dimensional view. The owls can do the same thing. Chickens can't, robins can't, ducks can't, but owls can. Their eyes are right in the front of their face, just like ours. They're big. They see basically the same light frequencies that we do. They have extremely good vision over a long distance. And so they have the same bifocal vision we do. But they went one giant evolutionary step beyond us. Their ears are in the front. Their ears are offset. So when they hear a sound, just as we can with vision and see a moving mouse, they can hear a moving mouse and know exactly where it is. They can triangulate the location of any noise they hear. So one of the key things about this owl and other owls is they can be in the air, hear something below them, and this owl, because its wings are so huge and it flies the speed of a paper airplane. I've seen them float across a meadow. They can't even be going 10 miles an hour. Maybe they're going 5 or 6. They're just going fast enough not to fall out of the sky. If they hear something, they collapse their wings and fall directly on it. So their hearing is their super skill that we can only imagine what it must be like. This is Shadow. I got to meet her. She spent most of her 20 plus years at the Lindsay Museum in Walnut Creek. And she was, at the time I wrote the book and did a lot of my research on it, she was the only captive great gray owl in the entire state of California. And she spent a lot of time going to classrooms. She couldn't fly very well. She'd been hit by a car when she was young in Minnesota. And they had a lot of rescued owls in Minnesota, so she got offered out, and fortunately, Lindsay had the good sense and the resources to take her in, and she was there for about 20 years helping educate people about owls. This is what an adult looks like on the left. They have a little bit of parentheses around the eyes, opening out around the nose, and then they have that little what is called in many books a bow tie, the little white line on the chest, and very pronounced facial discs. The head of a great gray owl is as big as a human head. The skull is about the size of a medium-sized human fist. So most of the size is feathers, layer after layer after layer of feathers. And the discs are there shaped specifically to funnel sound into the ears that are below each eye. So what do they eat? Small mammals, mostly. They like to sit on listening posts. This is a typical 5-foot fence post in a meadow not very far from Ashland, up in the Cascades at about 4,500 feet. They'll sit on that. They'll sit sometimes on logs that are lying on the ground. They even occasionally will get down and walk around, but mostly they like to be at about 3 to 6 feet above the ground, listening. If they don't hear anything, they may move up higher. Sometimes they'll move up to 30 feet and sit next to the trunk on a tree at the edge of the meadow until they hear something, and then they'll move much closer, like this owl in this picture. They like meadows that are free of brush. So things like ceanothus, manzanita, blackberry, a curse. They can't use those meadows. They can't get down through dense brush. So they need meadows that are either too wet or too dry to raise things like dense brush. And they also need the meadow to support a lot of small mammals. So in the Cascades, which is where they're very successful in most of Oregon, up until you get within 100 miles of the Columbia River, they're all along the Cascades. It's terrible soil created by volcanoes, in relatively recent history, drains very quickly. So most trees, other than a few willows, can't survive out there. Shrubs can't take it. It's too hard, too dry in the summer. So it's full of forbs and grasses and small legumes, all of which produce enormous number of seeds, which feed enormous numbers of voles and other small mammals. Although they will eat moles and shrews as well, but I'm sure most of the mammals they eat are small rodents. So they need a meadow that has very little or no brush. They need a good food supply, and they need a good roost in a nearby forest. So they don't like 80-acre meadows. They like what we call pocket meadows. A couple acres here, a couple acres there. They want to be able to get into the forest in a hurry. They want to be able to roost in the forest easily and efficiently. I mean, I've read a bit about osprey. It's not uncommon for an osprey that's got a nest to commute 20 miles one way to its fishing ground, catch the fish, haul it back to the nest. You can do that if you're catching a 2-pound fish
Cover a
that's
lot of
full of
ground.
fish oil and
But
protein.
when I
You
started
can't
thinking
do
about
that if
how
you're
I
eating
might
a
adapt
1-ounce bowl that's mostly fur. You've got to have the meal close to the nest or the roost. So when they nest in the Cascades, it's almost always within 30 yards of at least one or more meadows like this one that this guy's sitting in that are easy to hunt. They cannot fly 5 miles, catch a vole, and fly back. It's absolutely inefficient. They can hunt in snow. They don't tend to move around much. Occasionally, one will show up in an odd place in the winter. There was one, and I'm sure most of you know this, there was one in Humboldt County a few years ago, finally got run over by a logging truck. Had to have been a youngster from Canada. No Cascade or Washington State great gray owl in its right mind would have flown that far to such a weird, wet place. First of all, they're not waterproof. So the climate along the north coast of California is exactly the opposite. All the meadows there are full of brush. It's exactly the wrong place for a great gray owl. They would no North American great gray owl from the United States would ever find itself on the Humboldt coast on purpose. So it probably was a youngster that came down the coast from Canada and got trapped. This is the kind of stuff they eat. basically what they eat is whatever's on the menu locally. So what they eat around Yosemite, they probably eat a lot of kangaroo rats. They eat small animals like chipmunks if they get out in the meadow. As you get further north, the food changes. By the time you get to central Canada, they're eating lemmings, which of course we don't have in California and Oregon. So they eat what's on the menu. Ones in Scandinavia probably eat the European version of North American rodents. It is the only owl in the Strix genus, by the way, that's found all across the northern hemisphere. So they're found in northern Europe and northern Siberia. It's interesting that the California and Oregon great gray owls are far and away the most southern population on the planet. My supposition, nobody's done any decent research or fossil examination or anything, but they were forced south probably by ice sheets during ice ages, and then populations got isolated in places like the Cascades and Yosemite where they can survive. There have been genetic studies of the ones in Yosemite, and they are a genetic subspecies. They have no near relatives anywhere in the world genetically. So they should be an endangered subspecies of the great gray owl, but of course that's a whole political issue that has nothing to do with the genes. Here's one eating a least chipmunk, which is the smallest chipmunk in North America. It's about the size of a big vole. I think the body is about 3.5, 4 inches long. And these were pictures taken by a good friend of mine. And an adult least chipmunk doesn't even weigh 2 ounces. And you got to figure more than half of that is fur and tail. So they're not getting a lot of meat for every meal. Here's one flying over. Looks like he's getting ready to go down to the snow. And what they will do is they hit the snow head first. So if there's crust, they don't risk breaking a leg. And the head is like a big padded hammer. So it just breaks right through the surface. And at the last nanosecond, they bring their talons up and grab whatever it is they heard under the snow. It is not at all uncommon for them to catch a rodent or something crawling under the snow that may be as much as 8 inches deep, sometimes up to a foot deep. They can hear it and they catch it without ever seeing it. Here he is going in head first. And he caught his vole. This is Shadow's talons on the hand, on the glove of one of the keepers at Lindsay. And the reason this is important is because it shows you how they've adapted to their diet. These talons are not needle sharp, and they're about 1 inch long. So they're half as long as a great horned owl that would be more than happy to take your house cat. These guys can only take small prey. So they hunt a lot. Any great gray owl, in order to stay healthy and not lose weight, needs at least 4 small meals per day. They cannot take something big like a California ground squirrel, a tree squirrel, crow, all the things that you think of great horned owls being able to attack and take and rip apart. These guys can't do that. They have to have small prey. The fact that they're large, and we'll talk more about it later, is mostly their feathers. 12-inch tail and the longest owl wingspan in North America. They have the wingspan almost of a turkey vulture. Here's one. This is one of the most unusual pieces of evidence I gathered while I was working on my book. This is a great gray owl in southern Oregon eating, are you ready for this? Baby mountain quail. People that took the pictures saw this owl, and these guys were newborn. They couldn't have been more than a few days old because they're still pure white. They were running around on the forest floor, and she ate 4 of them before the mama quail convinced the babies to go hide under a shrub. Unusual, though. Mostly they eat mammals. This is what they look like when they're perched. There's one on a T-post, and on the left, an old fence post. Very typical perch. Because they can fly so slowly with their huge wings, their wings are extremely flexible. They have a tiny little wing load. And of course, like all owls, they have the little fibers at the end and the edges of every feather that breaks up the turbulence, so they make no sound. They're completely opposite of, say, a Canada goose taking off going. These guys can fly all the way across a meadow and there is not a whisper. So if you're on the ground and you're a 4-inch long vole, if you don't happen to look up at the right time, it's too late. So this explains, how the feathers make them soundproof, unlike most big birds. Great horned owls are about 22 inches tall. A great gray owl is 27. The wingspan is only about 44 inches, red tail 49. Most great gray owls are often way over 50, and sometimes into the low 60s if they're a female. Like all raptors, of course, the female great gray owl is larger. She needs more body mass. Sorry, I misspelled the third wingspan there with 2 eyes. Here's 2 typical perches. One on the post, may even be the same post we saw before. Here's another one on a drooping branch. And this is low down on a tree. This is not going to be 50 feet up off the ground like you'd find a red tail or a Cooper's hawk or something like that. It's going to be close enough to the ground that they can hear what's going on. This is one of the most unusual owl pictures I ever got a chance to get. A lady who lives at about 3,200 feet near Ashland had lived in her house about 15 years, never seen or even heard of great gray owls around, but she was a pretty good birder. She knew they were around. And a big fire broke out in the summer, late August, about 10 miles east of her at about 1,000 feet higher. Within a day, she had this guy hunting off her front porch. And we assume that he got burned out of his habitat because he was sitting on her porch, and just behind these shrubs was about 6 or 8 acres of grassland where there were lots of little rodents. So he had been forced out by the smoke and the fire, and he came and settled on her deck. It drove her poor dog crazy. He was there for about 2 days. Very few nesting records, particularly in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon. Up west of Colville, is where they found the first nest in Washington state of great gray owls. They can't obviously go as far west as the Cascades in Washington. It's way too wet. One would go to the Olympic Peninsula and probably drown in the first rainstorm. They just can't deal with that kind of moisture. So they're found in eastern Washington only. They didn't confirm nesting there until 1991. The research on great gray owls is pretty spotty. Other than the Yosemite Conservancy in California, there's been precious little work done on these southern owls in Washington, Oregon, and California. And because they have no economic impact, they don't seem to be endangered. They don't affect farm crops or livestock. They have been largely ignored. When I started doing the research, the best information I got was by calling both active and retired field biologists and just pumping them, spending an hour and a half on the phone, trying to take down everything they could remember about anything they'd ever seen. There's very, very little scientific work other than the work that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years by Yosemite Conservancy. Audubon thinks they're in great trouble because of climate change. I suspect that they are projecting some things that may not be totally accurate. When you read the sort of general accepted information in encyclopedia and stuff like that about great gray owls, it's pretty misleading. Most of the field guides, even as recently as 20 years ago, said this is a boreal species. No, it's not. It's a forest meadow species. It nests in oak trees in California. It nests in madrone in southern Oregon. It is not a boreal species. It's succeeded better there because it doesn't get shot or run over as much as it does in the places where it used to be. But I think if we could turn the clock back 220 years, they probably were great gray owls up and down the Central Valley of California, where the valley oaks at that time would have been 150 feet tall. The Native Americans regularly burned the meadows, which means the small rodents would have loved it. And so would the great gray owls because there wouldn't have been any brush in the way. The manzanita and the and small shrubs and stuff would have all been burned out. So there would have been big oak trees to nest in and hunt from, and lots of rodents on the ground. And I think they were probably also common up here in the Willamette Valley before agriculture took over. Here are their enemies, vehicles, of course, goshawks, great horned owl, pesticides, West Nile virus. When West Nile first moved west in North America in 2002, there was a wildlife rescue center in Minnesota, which gets a lot of Canadian youngsters that come down in the winter and don't know how to feed and get near starved or get hit by a truck or something. And they usually rescue 10 to 20 a year and manage to keep at least half of them alive. They lost every great gray owl in less than 10 days. They had never put up mosquito netting before. They'd never needed it. So West Nile came through, killed every owl in the place. So they are extremely susceptible to West Nile. Lack of nest sites can be a real problem. As most of you probably know, owls do not build nests. They take what they find. Some can nest on ledges. Some will nest in boxes that we build. These guys will nest on man-made platforms. So if there are great gray owls in the area, Audubon societies and stuff would do well to put up platforms. They put up about 3 dozen in Jackson County since I wrote the book. So there's a lot of places for them to nest. But in the wild, they either have to find a broken off tree trunk that's at least 30 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide, and then they can nest inside the rotted out part. Or they have to find an old raven nest or an old red-tailed nest, an old eagle nest, something like that. As far as we know, they never nest on cliff faces like some owls do. Barn owls will do that, so will great horned. Their annual sort of schedule, they've already done their courtship. By now, most of the adults will have a pair, and they're probably on their nest site now. They've decided where they're going to nest, but they're not going to lay eggs until the snow is gone and the little voles start reproducing. It's very critical for them to have a huge vole population, particularly in Oregon and California. Further north, it's different species. But anyway, whatever the dominant rodents are in the meadows, they need them to be breeding before they lay eggs. So they wait. And each spring, it depends on how fast the snow melts. 2 years ago in Jackson County, as far as we know, no great gray owl laid eggs. The drought had gotten so bad, the meadows were so dry that there were very few rodents left, and they just didn't bother. It's just like when El Nino hits the California coast and the cormorants and the puffins go, oh God, not this year. That's what happened to the great gray owls that one year. In June and July, they're brooding the young, and this is one of the most dangerous parts of a great gray owl's life. They leave the nest when they're about 2 weeks old. They're small, they can't run, they certainly can't fly. They've got a big beak already and big feet, and they have to find a way to climb back up into the trees, but not to the nest. We're not sure why they leave the nest. Our guess is that body parts of voles and maybe feces and stuff pile up and it's dangerous, unhealthy, but they leave their nest far too early to be able to care for themselves. So mom is now the guardian of 1 to 4 or maybe more babies that are out of the nest, still helpless, still needing to be fed, and she's hoping that they can find a way back up into the trees. So one of the things that my fellow owl nuts do when we're in an area where there's great gray owls breeding, if you find a 10-foot limb that's 4 inches across the bottom, you lean it up against a trunk. We put up lots of leaners because the babies can climb up with their big feet and their beak. And if they get 10 or 12 feet off the ground, they're starting to get up into the limbs of the smaller trees. And they can jump and sort of flap and maybe go 3 or 4 feet across a gap. But getting straight up a vertical trunk for a 2-week-old great gray owl can be really difficult. And many of them don't make it. Then in the summer and the fall, they're trained. They learn how to be owls. Usually they're ready to go on their own by October in Southern Oregon. That's been our experience. And once they can fly and follow dad around, he's the feeder. He's been feeding mom since she sat on the first egg. So he's got 4 meals for her, 4 meals for himself. When the babies are born, let's say there's 3, That's 4 meals per baby. So that's 4 for her, 4 for him, 12 for the kids. That's 20 meals a day. Now he's hunting morning, noon, and night. You can go up at noon in late May and June if it's a good breeding season for the great gray owls, and they're going to be sitting in the middle of a meadow, 4 acres or half an acre or whatever, if there's voles, and you're going to see them in broad daylight. I was up there a week ago looking for them, and we heard them, but we didn't hear them until dark, and we never actually saw one because they don't have any babies to feed yet. So it's dad eats 4 meals by midnight, mom catches 4 meals by midnight, and then they sleep the rest of the time. But once he's hunting for 16 to 20 to 24 meals a day, life changes completely. And he's always hunting all the time to feed somebody who needs one more meal. So mom will leave as soon as they can fly, the babies, and keep up with dad and follow him around and harass him and screech at him and say, where's my vole? Where's my vole? She goes off to another set of meadows by herself. So she's not competing for food anymore. And so dad does all the sort of teenage lessons. This is how you land. This is how you grab them. Here's where you can perch. This is where we roost at night. So he's with them and feeding them until they're ready to feed themselves, usually end of September, early October. And then in the winter, they tend to be all alone until sometime after the solstice. And then they start talking, the adults start talking to each other and decide whether they want to be a pair, whether it's the same pair as last year, or maybe one of them died. And so they're looking for a new mate. So there's a quiet period, really late October, certainly through Christmas and into early January, when you almost never see them or hear them because each one of them is hunting at night by itself. The nights are long. They have plenty of opportunity. So it's really May through July when you start to see them out in the sun, and sometimes all well into September, depending on how many youngsters there are. So that's why the trip is in early May. By then, mom is definitely going to be on eggs. So dad's hunting at least 8. If the eggs have got laid in April, he may be hunting for 14 to 16 to 18 meals a day. So he's going to be more likely to be out in the morning and evening. Here is an adult with 2 youngsters. This was taken in early October. It was already dark, but the guy overexposed it so you could see it. This is a dad in the middle and the 2 kids who've been following him around this meadow. And it's at milepost 19 on Dead Indian Memorial Road, east of Ashland, one of the favorite meadows they like to hunt. And this is what it looks like. This is what it's like to be the dad. They follow him around all day and never shut up. I don't know how he could hear a rodent because they never stop talking to him. They'll use all kinds of different things for nests, depending on what the habitat's like. In Eastern Oregon, there's a mistletoe species that grows up in some of the conifers, and it puts up spikes that go toward the sky. So it looks like a huge broom, and it's called a mistletoe broom. And they'll get inside those spikes and knock or squish the ones in the middle, and the ones around the edge form a little fence that keeps the eggs from rolling out of the nest. But they'll nest anywhere where there's a big limb or a tree trunk that's rotted out. And they will use man-made platforms as long as there's not an entrance. They have to be an open platform. The best platforms are at least 24 inches across with a 4-inch rim so the eggs can't roll out. They don't do any construction at all. This is the first great gray owl nest I ever saw right after I'd moved to Ashland from the Bay Area. A man that some of you guys probably know, Dick Ashford, who was mayor of the town of Sonoma and a big Raptor fan, had moved to Ashland a little before me, found I was up there and said, oh, let's go birding. He took me to this meadow one day and showed me this nest. And you can see this is about a 30-foot high Doug fir trunk that had broken off in a storm or something and rotted out over the years. And look how far out her tail sticks. I mean, she's 27 inches long, so she probably had like an 18-inch little hammock in there where she'd laid her eggs, and her tail sticks out the edge because there's no room for it inside the nest. This is a more typical nest. This was probably a raven nest, and we found out about it because it was near a campground, and the guy pitched his tent late in the evening and woke up in the morning and here's this huge bird above his tent watching him, and he ran up to the office and said, oh my God, what's that bird? He had no idea there was something called a great gray owl. And the little white puff is one of her babies. And this is a typical baby reaction. This is the oldest of the two in this nest that you just saw before. And he was on the edge. He was exercising, flapping his wings all the time. He was really Mr. Athlete. He was going to fly as quick as he could. He left the nest and we never saw him again. Didn't survive. The younger one, much more cautious, left the nest about a week later and did quite fine. Here's the baby, number 2, the one that did survive, next to mom on a log on the ground. My friend Peter Thiemann, who took all the pictures from my owl book, took this picture from about 40 feet away. At one point, mom turns around, looks at him. She probably heard the camera clicks, flew off into the forest. And he thought, oh, she's going to go get some food. No, she sneaked around and hit him in the back of the head, said, get the hell out of here. So he left. We found this same baby about a month later, already starting to grow real feathers, and was 30 feet up a tree, and dad was feeding it. So this one survived, even though the first one, the braver one, didn't. Here it is, looking through the, and here's the mom looking back at Peter going, I heard your camera click. There's the baby up close. About 2 weeks old. So no real feathers, little stubby wing thing. So it can sort of flutter and maybe make it from one branch to another if it's 2 or 3 or 4 foot jump. But you can see the big toes and the big beak. That's how they survive. They climb up back into the trees. Here's that same owl a month later. Now it's got real wings. It can go from one branch to another branch 10, 20 feet away. Can't get on the ground yet. Still not very safe because it's hard for it to take off. But if it's in the air, it can float and jump. And dad was feeding it. This is a nest platform. This is a location that we'll visit. It's near Howard Prairie Lake, east of Ashland. This platform has been up 20 years. It's been used in 11 of the last 12 years. During the height of the drought 2 years ago, they did not even bother to lay eggs. But every year that we've known about this platform and watched it, they've raised at least 2 young to fledglings age, sometimes 3 or 4. Oops. Here's a Bay Area birder. We were actually on our way to Klamath from Ashland, but the great gray owl was right along the highway. It took me over an hour to get people back in the car. I couldn't blame them. This owl was hunting that meadow where we saw the trio before, the dad and the 2 youngsters. It's the same meadow. It's right along a busy highway. And they'll hunt it sometimes for hours on end because it's got a little stream through the middle, and it's probably perfect for voles, which means it's perfect for great gray owls. This is the mom of that nest where there were 2 and the first one didn't survive. And she's been sitting around the nest for a while, so she goes out to stretch. Look at that wing. That's just one of her wings. There's one moving away, vole in its clutch. And here's my friend Shadow. I got to meet her. This was years ago when I was, right after the book was published. I got to go give a talk about her species, and she came and she was actually fairly attentive. She didn't make any noise, but she watched. I don't think she dozed off, so I took that as a great compliment. She wasn't quite full size because she got injured quite early, so she wasn't the full 27. She was about 23, which for a female is kind of small. But she was a real owl, and you didn't want to get anywhere near her talons because she would just tighten up on your arm. And she did 20 years of good educational work. So if anybody's got questions, either on chat, I'll try to open that up. And if anybody wants to open their mic and ask something, we'll see if we can do it.
Great. So Harry, first question is it unusual for an owl species to prey upon other owl species?
Well, it's not unusual for a great horned owl. They'll eat any owl they can catch. They're death on screech owls. So screech owls have to live places where the great horned owls either can't get at them or they aren't around. They eat barn owls. I'm sure they eat long-eared and short-eared owls if they ever catch them. They're pretty ferocious. I think the eagle owl in the old world is the same way. They'll eat anything they can catch. Most American owls eat fairly small prey. The one glowing example of not eating small prey, of course, is the pygmy owl, and he'll kill birds bigger than he is. So I suspect if he could find, a saw-whet or something like that, he might kill it. He's pretty ferocious. But most of the owls eat pretty small prey. I think it just makes for much more efficiency. Uh, I suspect the great gray owl, half their body mass is feathers, and it's a combination of insulation and wing size, which allows them to move very quietly, very efficiently. They have tested great gray owls. They can take the kind of cold that would kill most birds and most mammals. They can go down to 50 degrees below zero and stay there for an hour. And the minute they get back out, they're fine. Most animals could not take that. So they have an incredible both insulation and flight ability that far exceeds what even most birds could do. Which is why many of them don't migrate. They don't tend to come south unless there's no food in Canada, and then you start getting them into Washington, northern Minnesota, Montana. The only great gray owl that Audubon himself ever saw, he saw flying across Boston Harbor one winter day. So when he decided to draw a picture, he had to go to London and look at the dead samples they had there in a private collection. The fascinating thing about great gray owls, the Brits started finding them in central Canada in the early 1800s. And one guy collected two or three and sent them back to London. And so the natural scientists getting together in their club were talking about it and saying, God, why don't we have an owl like that? Because it came from Canada. They had no idea. And then somebody who wasn't one of the top scientists, but was an educated guy who just sort of came along to me and said, wait a minute, I've seen a painting of that bird in Stockholm. And they said, what are you talking about? So he got on a boat, went back, found the painting, tracked down the painter, and the painter didn't know he was painting an unusual bird. He'd seen it in northern Sweden when he was on some kind of hunting trip. So he painted a picture of it and sold it to some rich guy in Stockholm who put it up in his estate. And this guy happened to be staying overnight when he'd been there 5 years before and he'd seen the painting. But the white bow tie and the discs near the face or around near the eye, those parentheses and stuff, he knew right away that he'd seen a picture. And so he talked to the painter, and the painter said, oh, yeah, I saw it. And he showed him on the map where he'd been and seen a great gray owl. That was the first time the English found out that there were great gray owls in Europe. It was after they discovered them in Canada. But now we know they're all across the northern hemisphere. Here they come much further south than they ever do in Europe. A great gray owl in Germany is bizarrely rare. Once in a great while, one will come down from Scandinavia. But they train them over there. They train them with mice. So if you pay 75 euros, they'll take you out to a tame great gray owl who'll sit on the post and let you take its picture. We don't do that to our great gray owls so far. We haven't domesticated any of them.
There was a wonderful article, I think it was in Cornell's Living Bird, on great gray owls and how they hunt and in deep snow. And
Yes.
I think it's in the last couple years. But anyways, the concept of that article was someone who was interested in sound got together who was someone with interested in great gray owls, and they discovered that at least their research is pointing to the fact that the owl flies silently over deep snow more so that the owl can hear the vole rather than the
Yes.
hear the owl. So, and what
Yes.
they do is they hover a little bit over the spot where they hear the vole, and then they go straight down on top of it. It was a great art.
Yes. Yeah. And they will make, and I've seen these in the winter, when they hit the snow, if it's not icy, it's still soft. When they take off, there'll be this wing pattern where they've slammed the top of the ice, and you can see the outline of the wings down to an individual primary feathers. And in the middle, there'll be this conical shape where the talons and the beak went down. And if they caught something, there'll be blood drips on the snow. So you'll see this, what looks like an angelic shape with the blood of the victim in the middle if they've caught something in a snowy meadow. And the voles are active all winter. They have little, if you go up there now, but by the time we're there in May, most of the stuff will probably have been covered up by grass and stuff. But I was just up there, and the snow hasn't been gone that long, and there's still snowbanks on the north side of every stand of trees because it doesn't get sunshine. But most of the snow is gone in the open meadows. You walk across, you see these freeway interchanges that are an inch and a half wide and an inch and a half deep that the rodents use all winter to run around underneath the snow. So they're making lots of noise. They're very active. They don't hibernate. They don't sleep long days. They run around and eat the stuff they stored and look for more stuff to eat. And so, of course, they're active. They're running around these little rodent roads, and the great gray owl can hear them when they're moving.
We have about 30 people that have been enjoying your talk. Does anyone else have a question?
There's some stuff on chat. I can't open chat. Can you open chat and see what the
For some
questions are?
reason, I'm not seeing what's in there other than my own messages. Phyllis,
Oh, okay. Maybe that's
Phyllis,
what it is then.
yeah.
All right.
You can unmute yourself, folks, if you have a question to ask Harry before we sign off for the evening. I'm hoping people that are coming on the trip will have some questions.
Yeah, well, Harry, this is Phil Burton. I birded with you up in Malheur last year for a week,
Yeah.
and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again this time. This is so exciting, having only seen one great gray in Crane Meadow in Yosemite 30 years ago or so. Anyway, looking forward to it very much, and you are great. Thank you.
Good. I will give you some information about Yosemite. Yosemite Conservancy did a really good study of all the sightings and all the confirmed nestings in the history of Yosemite National Park of great gray owls, plotted them out, fed it into a computer, and the computer came back and said, X% of Yosemite is great gray owl habitat. You'll never see them in the other parts. You know what the percent was? 8% of Yosemite is great gray owl habitat. The other 92%, no great gray owls. Not now, not 50 years ago, not 100 years ago, and not next week. So, the few meadows where they're seen, that's it.
Oh. Well, I was lucky. Obviously, I was put onto it by another birder, but it was still a remarkable sight to see something that huge. And again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Harry, I know that there are quite a number of owls that are unknown to most people that are in kind of the foothills approaching the mountains where there are meadows.
Right.
I know Fish and Wildlife has started perhaps keeping track of them. I'm not sure, but it's very hard to get information. They basically have this information fairly private as they don't want to bother the owls, but I know there's more than people are aware of.
Yeah, and eBird does not allow you to put a specific location on a great gray owl sighting.
Right. So
for good reason.
Yeah.
They are such a photo magnet that they would probably get run over if anybody publicized where there was an active nest.
Yeah, well, so I'm hoping to learn enough about their habitat when we come up and work with you that maybe we can explore the Sierras a little bit down here and see if we can't find more great gray owls.
Yeah, well, the number one key, it's got to be a mature forest with dense canopy next to a small meadow that isn't cluttered with brush. Those are the absolute mandatory conditions. And then the meadow has to have a lot of food in it. Small mammals. They will occasionally take a frog or a junco or something, but 98% of their diet, as far as we know, is small rodents. And that picture I have of the one eating a quail, I have never found a biologist who has ever been able to duplicate or say, oh yeah, I knew that happened. So who knows? They may eat a more small quail than we imagine, but it's got to be a meadow that's open where it's easy to hunt. They don't have to deal with brush and sticks and kinnikinnick and stuff like that. They can't deal with that kind of stuff. Salal would just be driving nuts. Even sword ferns are too much for them. So they need grass and forbs that are soft and easy to get through. And there's got to be good, heavy canopy on trees that are at least 80 to 100 feet high nearby, where they can roost and eventually nest. Because they don't want to nest. They're not like osprey. They don't have a nest at the top. Their nest is about 30 to 40 feet up. That's where we put the platforms, right on the tree trunk in a tree that's got pretty good canopy, so they feel protected.
So this winter down here has been a little wetter than average. Is it similar up in Ashland area?
Yeah, it is. The drought has been as bad there as it was over most of California and southern Oregon. There are three pretty good size reservoirs that we'll probably see on this trip. None of them is over half full,
Oh, wow. So
and they were down to 5%
did you
a year and a
continue
half
with the
ago.
drought this year, or did you have kind of average rainfall?
They had about average. Further north, up where I live, we're way above average this year. I think Shasta Lake is pretty full. But when you get into Southern Oregon and the drainage systems are smaller, none of those reservoirs are full. Klamath Lake on the other side of the Cascades is, but it's got a really big river system coming in from the north. So it's now back to capacity for the first time, I think, in 5 years, 6 years, something like that.
Great.
So it's spotty, but it's certainly better than it was 2 years ago.
Well, on behalf of Napislano Audubon, Harry, I want to thank you very much for filling us in on a lot of information before the trip. We
Okay,
had over 30 people at one point.
great,
I know they've enjoyed what you've had to say. Any
great.
last questions before we close down for tonight? You can unmute yourself and then talk. Oh, here's one question I didn't see before.
Okay.
Well, there's one humorous question, which is, Harry, you mentioned, well, the humorous question is, do you miss San Francisco?
Sometimes I still visit a lot. I lived there or in the Bay Area from 67 to 2007. So I did most of 4 decades there. And still have, all the people I worked with when I was still working and, friends. Yeah.
So actually, there's more questions that I didn't see before. The first,
Okay.
any other reasons why babies leave the nest so soon that you can think of?
No, nobody knows. The gray gray owls don't answer in interviews, so you can't really tell. The assumption is that there's some health reason. Otherwise, why would they take the risk? I mean, most birds don't leave the nest until they can at least fly a little bit. And most of the other birds that leave the nest earlier, things like wood ducks, and they can swim. So, they don't need to fly. They can get out in a pond and follow mom around. But these guys can't fly. They can't swim. They can't run. They're still pretty helpless. I mean, they're not like a baby killdeer that's out of the egg and 3 hours later it's running at 20 miles an hour. And other owls don't do that. Most other owls don't even think about leaving the nest until they've at least got the wings so they can flap around up in the tree. So the assumption has to be that there's some health threat that they are somehow avoiding by leaving the nest, falling or plunging to the ground, and then trying to climb back up. I mean, that's a pretty high risk operation. So there's got to be something going on in and around the nest that must make that worthwhile. Maybe it's to get away from predators. I don't know. Maybe goshawks would be able to see them easier when they're in an open nest than they are if they're clinging to a half-inch branch right next to the trunk. So it could be something like that. So it's either medical health or predator health. There's got to be some reason that they got to get out of the nest that early.
Interesting. And the only thought that came to my mind is perhaps since they are different ages in the nest, it allows the parents to care for the younger ones if the older ones get out more on their own without bothering the younger ones.
Yeah, that could be. That could be.
So here's a
Better
next,
survival rate.
yeah, and possibly it evolved as a result of that. So Pat
Yeah.
Mahoney has asked, you mentioned feathers around the eyes and beak.
Yeah.
She didn't catch the term you used. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Is there a term for having feathers around the beak and eyes?
Uh, not that I know of. I'm sure there's some biologist term. But the key for them is that their beak is almost completely hidden in feathers. And I think partly it's insulation, and it's also because the beak is small and bright colored. Um, and if they cover it up, it doesn't show as much because it's quite visual. When you get really close to one, it's a bright yellow. So it may be just an attempt to cover it up, because this bird, when it sits in front of a trunk of a Doug fir or other conifer, it almost vanishes. It's the color of bark on conifer trees. I mean, it would show up in a birch and it shows up in aspen, but you put it next to the trunk of an oak or any conifer you can think of other than redwoods, which they don't nest in that kind of tree because those are along the coast. But they just vanish. But so the coloration, I think, is probably really critical. And that little white bow tie, could easily look like a bare twig or something from 50 feet, unless you really look closely. When they turn their back to you or turn their head away from you and you don't see their eyes, it's almost like they vanish, particularly in bright daylight. They're just gone. They just look like bark.
Another question from Terry Shore is, did the wildfires last summer impact the great grays around Ashland? There was a lot of smoke that came down into California from Oregon. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if it was
As
the,
far as we know, it didn't have a negative impact. People have been seeing them pretty regularly, and it doesn't seem like the population suffered. Once the babies can fly, they can outrun a fire. I mean, they're not spotted toadies or wren tits. They're not going to burn up when the shrub catches fire. So they leave. And one of the things they found about them is, in many cases, depending on how much damage the fire does, they will go back and use burned over meadows if the mammals didn't die. So if the fire is really quick and just goes through the top and opens up a meadow, they'll go back and hunt. They found them, youngsters particularly, that can move around more than mom and dad raising young. They'll follow clear cut crews. And the minute the crew leaves, they move into the clear cut and eat up all the mammals because it's easy hunting. So they're pretty adaptable birds. If a fire happens in nesting season, it's a whole different story. Then it's total disaster. But that's May, June, and sometimes into the first couple of weeks of July. And so far up here, most of the fires have been, late summer and fall. The smoke is bad, and it's got to be as bad for them as it is for any other human being or any other creature that has to breathe the air. But I don't think the fire itself is a threat because they can fly fast enough to get away.
So the last question I see is, what are our odds of seeing great grays on our trip with you? Is it pretty likely? You have some staked out?
Yeah, we've got some good locations. I was there for 2 days, as I said earlier this month. The day after I left, two local birders went to exactly the same spot we'd been, but they stayed until it was dark, and really dark, and they saw 3 owls. I was with the guy who was hoping to do video. So once it got too dark for his camera, he said, well, screw it, let's get out of here. So we left. We had eaten an early dinner and gone back up for sunset. And we will do that the first night. If we don't find him in the morning on the first day, we will eat an early dinner and go back up, anybody who wants to, and I presume everybody will. And we'll stay until it's so pitch black you can't see. because even if they have babies are still in the nest, dad has got to feed them. He's got to feed mom, and she's almost 99% sure going to be at least on eggs, even if they haven't hatched yet. By mid-May, she's going to have a nest, and she's going to have eggs in it because there's plenty of food. You could tell by looking at the meadows when I was up there earlier this month that the vole population is through the roof. I mean, there were vole tracks everywhere. And so they're going to have a really good spring, and they're going to lay eggs. And the worst that can happen is she's sitting on the nest and he's got to feed her and him. So that's 8 times a day he's got to hunt. And we'll spend as much time as people can stand looking for these guys. They'll come out in the morning and the evening a lot if they can't catch enough prey overnight. So like a short-eared owl, it's not at all uncommon to see them, 2 or 3 hours after dawn, or have them come out an hour or two before sunset. And as time goes on, even in early May, once I saw one at noon on a bright sunny day. It was 78 degrees and he was hunting in a meadow. And once Peter Thiemann, my camera friend, found the nest, he had 2 young and a mom to feed, and he was hunting 24/7. So we should, I think, have a very good chance of having a male or 2 that's got babies to feed. That means, 16 kills a day in a 24-hour period. That's going to keep him busy.
Great, that's fantastic. Well, we
Yeah.
really look forward to the trip, and on behalf of Audubon, I want to thank you very much for
Thank
giving
you.
us a heads up and a wonderful talk to preview our trip. So,
Good.
folks that signed in, thank you very much for coming. And there's a lot of thank yous in the chat right now. So,
Great. Good.
great. All right. Well, thank you very much. And everyone, those that are coming on the trip, we'll see you up there on May 10th, I think it is. And
Yep. Okay. I just have to add one other thing because Ashland is home of the Shakespeare Festival. Owls well that ends well.
okay, well, make sure you have your reservations, folks, because they fill up with people coming up for Shakespeare. So
Yeah, there's all those people from the Bay Area that come up there to do stuff,
Thanks, Harry.
You're welcome.
that's Wendy, and she's helped me set up everything. Wendy Cole's done a great
Great.
job organizing this trip. Thank
See
you.
you soon, Wendy.
Yeah,
See ya.
Mark,
Bye.
Wendy, Harry,
Bye.
thank you very much for everything. See you soon.
Great.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a safe and peaceful evening. Talk to you soon.